Welcome. My name is Stephanie Georgakis-Abbott. I'm the Associate Director of Presidential Studies here at the Miller Center. I thank you all for joining us tonight for this exciting event, and I want to thank the Global Inquirer for partnering with us on this event. I think this is the second time we've done this, and it went well the first time that we're really happy that they approached us to do it again. And thank you to our speakers for joining us on this evening for this really exciting conversation. So we're going to kick it off with a short video, and then Emma's going to take over from there. Thank you. Oh, one more thing. Please silence your cell phones if you haven't checked them already, just to make sure that we don't get any interruptions during the program.
Testing. All right. Hello, it's so great to see so many of you here with us today. And welcome to Global Inquirer's Spring 2020 live episode. The Global Inquirer is an undergraduate research podcast, and each week we bring you stories from across the world to explain how global trends are impacting real lives. I'm your host, Emma Ross, and today we have a panel with us to discuss the significance of tax havens, namely how they keep the wealthy wealthy. They will also discuss the significance of 2016's Panama Papers, which shed light on the process of hiding funds overseas. And as they go along, and if something about their narrative grabs you, hold on to that thought and please bring it up during our Q&A at the end. And if you're watching via Facebook, you can also comment a question and we'll try to get to that at the end as well. So I'm looking forward to following along with their discussion and conclusions. We truly have an amazing panel here with us tonight. It is my pleasure to introduce our researchers who I've looked up to throughout my entire time at the Global Inquirer, and our highly distinguished guests who will help us unpack this complex topic. On our left, we have Anna von Spakovsky, a global security and justice major. In addition to her vast contributions to the Global Inquirer podcast, she is also vice president of the University of Virginia's International Relations Organization. And on your right here, we have Balthazar Marin, also a fourth year foreign affairs major with a minor in public policy. And many of you may recognize him, my predecessor as the Global Inquirer's host. And moving on to our distinguished guests, we are incredibly happy to have here with us tonight Professor Ruth Mason, Edwin S. Cohen Distinguished Professor of Law and Taxation here at the University of Virginia's Law School. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Joseph Thorndike, a tax historian and writer for Tax Analysts, the preeminent tax journal in the United States. I'd like to thank the panel for participating in what is sure to be a riveting discussion about skirting the law, a historic leak, and hiding away past riches. Thank you.
Well, Professor Mason, Dr. Thorndike, thank you so much for being here. It really is a pleasure and an honor for all of us. As Emma mentioned, the Panama Papers play a central role in our discussion tonight. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, Anna, can you give us a brief overview of what that all means?
Yeah, absolutely. So our story starts on April 3rd, 2016, when over 120 news organizations simultaneously posted articles about the Panamanian law firm Mossack Fonseca. So this law firm is one of the world's top creators of shell companies, which are corporate structures that clients can use to hide their assets. They incorporate them in tax havens, such as the British Virgin Islands, and then they can move money through different jurisdictions to hide where it's coming from. Now, someone at this law firm had leaked 11.5 million documents, so that's 2.6 terabytes of data, to a German newspaper. And they gave it to the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Over the course of a year, 400 journalists all across the world investigated these documents and eventually came out with what is known as the Panama Papers. So this isn't necessarily new information in that Mossack Fonseca had actually been fined before for similar practices, but it was unprecedented in its scale. So for context, the WikiLeaks, or the WikiLeaks leak in 2010 is probably well known to a lot of you. And if the data released in that leak was equivalent to the population of San Francisco, the data released in this leak would be equivalent to the population of India. So that kind of gives you a sense of its scale. The data includes emails, financial spreadsheets, passports, corporate records that all date back to 1977. So it really gave an unprecedented look into how they operate. So what exactly did they find? As I was reading through this, one of the things that kind of jumped out to me was their use of intermediaries. So a lot of international banks would actually contract the firm. So these are banks like HSBC, Deutsche Bank, huge banks that you've all heard of. And having offshore accounts isn't necessarily illegal, but because they can be used to hide the ownership of assets, firms are required to abide by certain due diligence standards so that they know who their clients are. That seems pretty logical to all of us, I would say. But the way they operated, they actually didn't know who a lot of their clients were. So the way that Mossack Fonseca worked was they would operate through these intermediaries, so lawyers, accountants, bankers, and they would basically make these intermediaries follow these due diligence standards, while at the same time, the intermediaries were making the law firm apply by these due diligence standards. So at the end of the day, when these leaks came out, you had frantic emails between the law firm and between these intermediaries trying to figure out who actually owns these shell companies. And Mossack Fonseca, for the most part, didn't know who their clients were. So, for example, 2 months after the documents leaked, Mossack Fonseca couldn't name 70% of the 28,500 active companies that they had created in the British Virgin Islands. So they didn't know who their clients were. And the issue with this is then you get people that are involved in criminal activity, money laundering, tax evasion, that can slip through and use Mossack Fonseca to hide their assets. So in the end, 33 individuals and companies who were blacklisted by the US for things like narcotics trafficking and aiding in terrorism were clients of Mossack Fonseca. But what was even more shocking to me was they weren't just involved in these sort of lies of omission type schemes. They actually proactively offered better ways to hide money even when they knew who their clients were, even when they'd been outed as people that say were involved in an investment scheme in South Africa. When the firm was under scrutiny by law enforcement, by international agencies, they would actively destroy and backdate records. So one email exchange in 2007 showed that backdating records was so common that they would offer $8 for every month that they would backdate the record. And they offered that as a normal thing for their clients. Another interesting case study actually happened in Nevada, which is one of the top 10 tax havens that they utilized, interestingly enough. A crony of a former president of Argentina had used a branch of Mossack Fonseca to create 123 different companies to hide money that he had siphoned from government contracts. And the US District Court of Las Vegas subpoenaed Mossack Fonseca to get details about this information. But they claimed that this branch wasn't affiliated with them at all. They sent people to destroy and take paper records. They tried to wipe all of their computers. And they actually were preparing for the branch manager to lie if she was asked to testify under oath and say that she was operating a company that wasn't involved with Mossack Fonseca at all. So that's just a few examples of the way that they operated. They had many, many more schemes, but those are just a few of them. And then I think what a lot of people here are interested in probably is the fallout of the Panama Papers, because this was a worldwide reaction. There were links to 12 current and former heads of state and 60 relatives and associates of these heads of state. So there were protests in a lot of the countries where politicians were named. You can imagine some of the usual suspects were a part of this. The firm helped Russian state banks and people close to Putin hide assets. The papers also linked 8 current and former members of China's Politburo, as well as Xi Jinping's brother-in-law. But there were also cases completely different from this. So you had people that were hiding assets from mining in the Congo. You had even stolen money from one of UK's most famous bank heists. You had spouses that were trying to hide assets from each other in divorces. My, I guess, favorite case for this was actually a family in New York who owned a painting that someone claims was looted from his grandfather, his Jewish grandfather, from the Nazis, and was asking for it back. And the family created a shell company so they could claim that the painting was not owned by them. So it really runs the gambit of people and all the crazy things that they're trying to do. So the list goes on. You can look up all of these really crazy cases. One of the protests that were going on was actually in Iceland. The prime minister, it turns out, had owned an offshore company that held millions of dollars in bonds in 3 Icelandic banks that he had been negotiating with during the 2008 financial crisis. So while this isn't technically illegal, people saw it as pretty immoral, and he actually resigned because of that. So the law firm itself, interestingly enough, did not close its doors immediately. It actually dug in deeper, which I think speaks to the industry as a whole. They offered to change the names of their client shell companies. They changed the names of their branches worldwide. They offered special deals and slashed prices, but eventually it was all too much for them. So a year later, they did close for good. And investigations are still ongoing. As a result of this, countries have instituted over 150 different inquiries and investigations. But of course, we're still seeing the impact 4 years later. The US has indicted 4 people, 2 of which have now pled guilty. But again, we're still seeing things evolve. And I want to give it over to our experts to tell us a little bit more about the context of these papers and then also their impact. As someone with no background in taxes, the scale and the complicity of these intermediaries and these banks was really, really shocking to me. But of course, this isn't necessarily a new phenomenon. So Professor Mason and Dr. Thorndike, what was your reaction when this story broke in 2016? I mean, were you surprised?
So by the time 2016 rolled around, we were already aware. This was not the first leak. So if you want to go to the first leak, we have to go back to 2008 with the US prosecution of UBS, the Swiss bank. So Anna highlighted more the role of the lawyers in the law firm. And there's an earlier story that highlights the role of the bankers. So the way that Americans use offshore accounts to evade their US tax is trivial. All you need to do is have a foreign bank account and then not declare the income earned in that account. That's it. There's nothing more complicated than that. You don't need a shell company, you just need to lie on your tax return, okay? So you had all of these Swiss bank accounts, right? The storied Swiss bank account. And the problem from the US perspective is the United States cannot secure the information. It doesn't know about those accounts. It doesn't know how much income is earned. So if the taxpayer is willing to lie, that's it. So the question was, can we or how can we get this information? And the single person who was probably most helpful on this was a man named Bradley Birkenfeld, who was himself a Swiss banker. He's a US citizen working in Switzerland to help wealthy Americans hide their money. And, you know, at some point, he started feeling like he maybe shouldn't be doing this anymore. Now, why he decided that the job that he previously liked, he no longer liked, is a question you can, you get one answer if you read his book, right? But one possible answer to that question is, or one possibility is that his UBS denied him his bonus. And then ultimately UBS did pay him his bonus, but Birkenfeld decided he was still angry. Okay. So he brought all of this information about how the Swiss bankers were helping Americans to avoid their taxes, and he brought it all to the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. And this led to a prosecution of UBS, specifically a prosecution of UBS Switzerland for the illegal practice of banking in the United States. And it led to a deferred prosecution agreement where UBS agreed to pay the United States government $780 million. And UBS had to sort of not admit to criminal activity, but admit to having engaged in certain practices, including helping Americans hide their funds. And you can go online and read the deferred prosecution agreement. There's lots of cloak and dagger stuff in there. They taught their clients how to smuggle diamonds in tubes of toothpaste to get them out of the United States. They told their bankers to lie to US customs officials about why they were coming into the United States. They told their bankers, don't log calls on the database with your US customers. There's lots and lots of evidence that they were fully aware, right, that what they were doing was incompatible with US law, okay? So as part of the deferred prosecution agreement, they had to agree that they would no longer illegally bank in the United States, so that instead of UBS Switzerland running an illegal banking operation in the United States, UBS US was a regulated entity by the United States would conduct banking activities in the United States. So Birkenfeld ultimately ended up being prosecuted by the United States for his participation in helping Americans hide their funds. So he ended up being sentenced to 40 months in prison by the Justice Department prosecuted him. But the Department of the Treasury was really glad for his help. So Treasury awarded him the largest ever whistleblower payment in US history, $104 million, which was a percentage of the funds recovered. Okay? So now I know you're doing that math, right? What is the daily payment for each day that Bradley Birkenfeld spent in prison? But the prosecutions of Swiss banks and led to more requests by the United States for information, and ultimately led to a law commonly called FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, which directly regulates foreign banks. It's a law passed by the United States that directs foreign banks that they must report on US account holders' accounts in these foreign banks. Now, you might ask, how can the United States regulate foreign banks? Aren't those banks already regulated by the countries in which they reside? The answer is yes, and this turned out to be a big problem. The way the US regulated extraterritorially these banks is to say, hey, you give me the information, or we're going to assess a withholding tax. On every US source dividend or interest payment made to your bank, we're going to take 30%. You want to avoid that fee? You'll tell us about our account holders. This created a real problem. because Switzerland has bank secrecy. So the Swiss banks were subject to this requirement by the US that they reveal the US account holders, but simultaneously they were subject to a requirement under Swiss law that they not reveal the identity of the US or any banking information about the US account holders. So this ended up being a diplomatic dispute that was resolved when then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton went to Switzerland, and they agreed that a certain number of names would be released. Not all of the account holders, but a subset. So then the US said, listen, we're going to get all these names, we're going to get all these accounts, maybe yours. So come in, admit what you did, pay a fine and some penalties, and we won't prosecute you. Okay? So through this deferred prosecution agreement, and then this amnesty, and then finally FATCA, which is supposed to reveal the accounts going forward, all the different strategies the US took to try to get to these accounts. But obviously not perfectly. Because then in 2016, we get the Panama Papers.
I think it is interesting to note, of the $104 million, the U.S. government decided to take the taxes out for Bernfield. They weren't going to let him declare that himself, which is important to note. But I did have the pleasure of picking up his book. It is a bit of a whirlwind. I kind of recommend it. He's a bit of a character. And it seems as if throughout the book he's trying to boil it down to kind of a moral obligation that he had. And he spends a lot of the time in the book trying to defend what he did. He's also extremely angry at the DOJ. He says, quote, "The DOJ reached out for my treasure trove with one slimy hand and slapped cuffs on with the other." He talks a lot about revenge. And as professionals functioning in the tax realm, how do you feel about what ultimately happened to him? On one hand, he was rewarded all the money. On the other hand, he did go to jail. Is this a fair punishment? Does it balance out morally?
Well, I should say that, so my publication named him Man of the Year for the year that he made his disclosures. I think that's a good question. There is I think the problem is that his motives are suspect, right? But I think trying to assess I think we should try to probably set aside his motives, and just try to look at whether what he did is whether we should applaud what he did in and of itself. Can we be happy about that, about leaks like that, and feel like the ends justify the means, or is that sort of compromise of privacy, is that too much? Does it push too far? I'd be interested to know actually what you think about that, Ruth. It's not unprecedented. It's not even particularly new. The tax system has relied on that kind of whistleblowing for 100 years, and because certain pieces of information are unknowable to the tax collector unless is disclosed to them in some way. Certain, as I'm a historian, so the tax man has gotten better about knowing what's up in our financial lives over the last 100 years. They've gotten more and more sophisticated, but certain pieces of our certain elements of our financial lives are hidden even now, and especially globalization has made it easier and easier to hide parts of our financial lives, especially if you're rich. So the question, from the beginning with the income tax, when the income tax was new, they relied on whistleblowers to get a window into what people were up to, and we rely even now, and you can still do that. You can, the Treasury still relies on that. So I'd be interested to know what you think about that. I do think it's morally fraught. It doesn't sit well with a lot of people, and it especially doesn't sit well because these people are rewarded for ratting people out.
I definitely take the point, and I see that both sides of this issue. I think that whistleblower protections are really important, right? There's we could separate this into two questions. Should whistleblowers be protected, and then should they be rewarded? I think the first is a much easier question, right? So whistleblowers should be protected. We had some, not in the United States, but some leaks in Europe. I'm thinking specifically of the PwC leaks, where there was an employee inside PwC that leaked a bunch of client records. There were threats of prosecution of the whistleblower, and so I think that there should be protection from that. That's a much harder case to say, should the person then be able to cash in? You could look at it from the perspective that Joe was this person deserved this, but you could also look at it from an incentive perspective, right? So, Birkenfeld presumably had in mind that he would make a whistleblower claim, and likewise so do many others. So, this is information. Without the bounty, right, we might have less information.
So you said that we've kind of relied on whistleblowers, and I had mentioned earlier, that Mossack Fonseca had been fined in the past and had been under scrutiny in the past. So it almost sort of feels we're operating like someone described it as whack-a-mole, where you're getting kind of closing one loophole, one financial weak point, and then people kind of move to another weak point. So is that just inevitable? Is that the nature of the system, or do you think that's something that can change?
That's the nature of the tax law to some degree, right? I mean, there's no such thing as a perfectly crafted, airtight tax law. The reason tax lawyers are highly compensated is because they take a set of rules and find creative ways around those rules. I mean, it's important to make the distinction here between finding creative and legal ways around a set of rules and hiding money overseas, which are completely different things, really. And politically, they're often not seen as different things, and people can be outraged about that legal tax avoidance, and it can be politically every bit as powerful, but they're really quite different. And a lot of the examples that we're talking about here are tax evasion, flat out tax evasion. It's illegal, you go to jail. Whereas tax avoidance is typically, it may end up being illegal if you didn't do it well, but you don't typically go to jail for it. You end up paying fines and penalties or whatever else. But I think that you have to expect that that tax is a game of whack-a-mole, and even tax evasion to some extent. People will continue to find new ways to hide money. I think we've gotten pretty good in the last 15 years at shutting down a lot of the more obvious ways of doing this. And I mean, you're much more involved in this than I am, but it does seem to me that globalization opened lots of new avenues to tax evasion, and through a lot of creative lawmaking, they have managed, the federal officials have managed to shut down an awful lot of that.
Yeah. So I mean, things get better. They might not get perfect, but so after FATCA, after the United States put this huge penalty and said, give us information or else, the immediate response from the rest of the world is, who do you think you are? You can't regulate my banks, right? This is unilateral and extraterritorial. That was the first impression, first reaction. The second reaction was, we want to do it too, right? So FATCA leads to something called CRS, the Common Reporting Standard, which is what all the rest of the world uses, and it's modeled on FATCA. It's somewhat different. But so all the countries in the world basically are on board with this idea that there should be automatic information exchange. So things get better. It becomes harder to avoid tax. It used to be, it was so easy. You were almost, a sucker for not doing it, right? But now, you have to go through more steps, and people might feel more qualms if they have to go through a shell company as opposed to just inheriting an account from their grandparent or something like that and just not continuing to not report it. But while things get better, they don't get perfect. So FATCA applies to other countries. It doesn't apply to us. Now we have domestic reporting of bank accounts, but US banks don't report to other countries. They don't have the same reporting requirements to other countries, which means now the US is a great place to have your secret bank account if you're a foreigner. I ran into a friend at an international tax conference, and he was from Switzerland, and he was like, "You're FATCA. This is unbelievable. We can't do anything anymore." And he said, "And what about you? You have all the secret accounts now." And my response was, "Well, we can FATCA you, but you can't FATCA us." That the size of the market matters.
And has CRS done anything to kind of counteract this in terms of its relation to the United States?
So, I mean, now, so the other countries, we have harmonization as to what countries want, which makes things easier for the banks. So there's a big concern for the banks, too. We don't want to look just for Americans, and we don't want every country to impose upon us a different requirement so that we can't actually do our banking business. So the idea that everybody has nearly the same standards is very helpful.
Fantastic. Well, kind of want to shift gears here a little bit. It's as if we're at a bit of a cultural inflection point. Larger and larger segments of our society seem to have taken up this cause of not letting people and corporations get away with hiding their money, in part because of the events of the Panama Papers, and in some part because of Bradley himself. And this has certainly been a rallying cry of the left, as we've seen in the past in these Democratic nominations. And that has been bolstered by the 2017 Tax Returns Act, where the top 5% of earners got a 2.2% increase in after-tax income, while the rest of us only got a 1.7% increase. So we still see these shadows of inequality even in these tax reforms. But it's also manifesting as this distrust of major corporations. The corporate tax rate went from 35 to 21%, and it has been a rallying cry from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris to Bernie Sanders that the top corporations paid $0 in taxes in 2018 on something like $72 billion in profit. And while we're not here exactly to discuss the economics and the morals of corporate tax code, that'll be for another live episode, it speaks to kind of this pushback we've seen on the ideas of corporations not paying their taxes. For example, we have the 2016 EU-Ireland tax fiasco, we can call it.
That's a fine term as far as I'm concerned.
Perfect. In 2016, the EU Commission declared that Ireland had offered illegal tax benefits to Apple. After the end of a 2-year investigation, they said Apple was required to pay $13 billion in back taxes to Ireland. Basically, Ireland had given them a sweetheart deal. Their usual corporate tax rate was 12.5%. Apple, over the years, was paying anywhere between 0.05% and 3.7%, so well below their already incredibly low rate. And not to mention, Apple has about $230 billion in cash and assets that they fail to repatriate to the United States in an effort to avoid taxes. So I just want to ask Professor Mason and Dr. Thorndike, how has this trend morally kind of manifested itself in laws that have been created and movements throughout the world and here at home? How are we reacting, and why are we reacting in this way to corporations and people who just refuse to pay their taxes?
I think that corporations are the complicated a part of this equation here, right? So, I mean, the individual side of things is fraught, but easier to get our minds around. Rich people, less rich people. We don't like rich people. We want to make them less rich. That's the wealth tax argument. Corporations are more complicated because it introduces this notion of competitiveness and international competition and the pressures that corporations are under. It introduces a whole new set of issues that really do complicate the debate. Corporations do operate under pressures that individuals do not. And so in the US, corporations were saddled with what was one of the highest marginal tax rates prior to 2017 in the world, either the highest or one of the highest marginal tax rates. And there was a decent argument to be made that that was, if not unsustainable, at least unhelpful or unwise, and that something needed to be done. But the problem is what needs to be done. You know, if a given rate is unsustainable, it doesn't tell you what the rate should be. If a rate is 39%, should it be 35%? Should it be 30, 29, 25, or 20? And that is a political argument that is not easily settled. The corporate rate was cut dramatically in 2017. That was just one part of a very complicated corporate tax reform that included all sorts of international provisions designed to stop corporations from shifting a lot of their profits overseas, or at least to limit their ability to shift profits around. It was a complicated story. Politically speaking, it's even more complicated because the rate reductions are sort of headline numbers that capture public attention, and that's why I think you see the Democratic candidates uniformly proposing increases in the headline corporate tax rate because American voters tend to think that corporations are not paying their fair share. They thought that when the rate was high, they think that now. Almost across the board, almost across time, voters tend to say that corporations are not paying their fair share. This is not an easy question to wrestle to the ground because corporations are not individuals, and what constitutes fairness in terms of what corporations are paying, it is enormously complicated, but it is politically very powerful, and so I'm going to take a total buy on this. I don't even have an opinion on it. You can make a very decent argument from 30,000 feet that there shouldn't be a tax on corporate profits. The corporate profits should be taxed entirely at the individual level. There are practical reasons why that's difficult or maybe impossible to do, but you could make a very principled argument. Even if you're a progressive who believes very much in taxing the rich and giving to the poor, you could still make a very strong argument that all that money should be taxed at the individual level and not even try to do it at the corporate level. But I think as a matter of sheer politics, it's very hard to do, and the 2017 tax reform has tried to rationalize the system in this globalized world to some degree. It had some, in my view, it had some reasonable elements to it. It had some indefensible elements to it, but we're not exactly, we haven't achieved any grand, perfect solution.
So, Balthasar mentioned the reduction in the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, which sounds like a really big reduction, and it is. But that 21% ends up putting us much closer to all of our trading partners. So we had this way outlier rate. And if you think about, if you're the person in the company in charge of tax planning, and you work for a multinational that's in many countries, your priority list of which country's tax to avoid is just a list of tax rates, right? I mean, and considering the base as well, right? But you want to avoid first the place where you are taxed the highest. So not only was the US rate it was important that the US rate was out of whack compared to all of our trading partners. So that rate had to come down, and it did. The question, so, Joe raised this difficult question of what's the right rate? 0 or more than 0 or less than 0? Is that the right rate? Should we be subsidizing companies in order to create jobs? Many localities in this country think so. Another really difficult question to answer is where? Where are a corporation's profits? When you say that a corporation shifted its profits, that suggests that you have a notion of where the profit should have been in the first place. Are the profits where the employees are? Are they where the shareholders are? Are they where the company's managers are? Are they where the manufacturing is? Are they where the consumer is? And different countries may have different answers to those questions. And a lot of this under our current regime ends up being within the control of the taxpayer. So there's a lot of choice left open to the taxpayer about where they declare their income. And if they have the choice, it should be no surprise that they choose low tax jurisdictions. And so that case with Apple and Ireland really was a where question, right? So Apple says, where are our profits? Says to the Commission of the European Union, where are our profits? Not Ireland, right? And what's Ireland's answer to where is Apple's profit? Also not Ireland. This income should have been declared somewhere. Since Apple declared it nowhere, and Ireland's before us, we'll make it Irish, right? But that doesn't jibe with other countries, particularly the US conception of where the income is. So the United States actually tried to intervene as a party in that case to say, hey, Commission, if you assign this income to Ireland, that means I don't get it.
One of my favorite parts about that story is the Irish reaction. You would think that, all right, Apple owes you $13 billion, Ireland would be pretty happy about that, but they actually rejected it. They're very much on the side of Apple because the long-term effects of what that could mean for them as a kind of, this is a moral gray area if they technically are a tax haven. I think we can all agree they are. But some countries don't seem to think so, including the United States. But I digress, is that major US corporations account for an inordinate amount of Irish growth. They make up something like 10% of the labor force in Ireland. And so after some time and after some thought, it makes sense that they would try and reject this EU ruling and come down on the side of Apple, say, Apple, keep your money, because the long-term profits that we have from you and from all these other transnational corporations who choose to kind of headquarters in Apple is far outweigh that in the end. So it's, to me, a little comical and in a roundabout way makes sense, but at first glance, not always.
I mean, there were definitely shenanigans.
Yes.
I mean, no pun intended in the Apple case, right? So, like, whether the income belongs to Ireland, right, which is the Commission's position, is a separate question from whether Apple engaged in tax planning that was overly aggressive, right? So you could say, well, they should have declared their income somewhere, and we could all probably agree on that. Then the question, but then I wouldn't necessarily agree that the right place was Ireland.
Well, with that, thank you very much. I think we're going to move into the question and answer portion of our time here. So if anyone has something to say, we will have a traveling mic.
Yes, you talked about the tax rate went from 35 to 21%, but what was the actual average tax rate that U.S. corporations paid prior to the 2017 tax law change?
It differs so much between industries. I don't actually know the answer to that question across industries. How about quite a bit lower? And the question, to back up again, the question is, does it matter? Like, what matters more? The marginal rate, which does apply to some companies in some industries, are getting pretty close to the marginal rate, even if they actually are paying close to the marginal rate. And some industries are paying, 5%. So some industries in which it's easy to shift a lot of their profits overseas, and which have a lot of intellectual property, which they can license to a subsidiary in a low tax jurisdiction, they're paying single-digit rates. And some companies which have a very hard time doing that because all their business really is here and they don't have a lot of intellectual property, they're paying very close to the marginal rate. So that's one of the problems why corporate tax reform was so difficult to actually achieve, was because the corporations were not all on the same page. The industries were not all on the same page. It was actually not a minor miracle, a huge miracle that they actually managed to get this over the line. And part of the way they did that was that they reduced the rates so much that almost everybody could get something out of it. And they greased the skids by bringing the small businesses in with a gigantic tax preference for small businesses, a 20% preference for income for like partnership income. So I don't know the answer about what the overall effective average tax rate was, but it was quite a bit lower. And you generally hear people say it was it was closer to what our trading partners were paying, and perhaps that's so. But a lot of economists would say having the statutory marginal rate at 35% was still destructive. So.
Well, I have a question. Oh, sorry. If the corporate tax rate was 35%, how did Apple get away with not paying anything?
Ooh, through clever machinations and taking advantages and differences between different countries' laws. It's really simple. The United States has a rule that defines when you're a tax resident, a corporate tax resident, subject to tax by the United States on all of your income. Are you incorporated in the United States? The answer is yes. You're a US company, taxable on your worldwide income. Ireland has a different rule. Ireland's rule says you're taxable in Ireland, you're a tax resident in Ireland if you're managed and controlled in Ireland. So you incorporate in Ireland, you manage and control in the United States. What do you have? Stateless company. That's where you put your income. That part's obvious, right? So if you're not subject to tax on your worldwide income anywhere in the world, right, that's a gap, a big one, right? But then the second question is, okay, we all agree that's a gap. What do we do? What's the right solution to the gap?
We didn't provide answers.
Depends whether you ask the United States or the European Commission.
So first off, thanks so much for shining some light on this, because I think a lot of it got lost with the 2016 election and a lot that followed. And my question actually kind of relates to that, to just give a little framing, and please correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my understanding is that there were a lot of non-U.S. persons whose accounts and whatnot were revealed through the Panama Papers. Particularly, I think y'all mentioned like some Russians earlier on, and then a lot of maybe Middle Eastern countries. And so I think I have heard a little bit about personal blowback for reporters and journalists who were involved in the work, assassinations and suspicious deaths and whatnot. But then on a wider scale, as far as, I wonder if you can speak to some of the international relations aspect. I believe that the Magnitsky Act that has led to a lot of the sanctions against Russian oligarchs is related to the outcome of the Panama Papers, but I'm not 100% on that. So if you could speak to the impact on other individuals involved in the reporting, and then also maybe the international relations and political aspect, I'd appreciate that.
I don't know the answer. Do you?
Well, that's a big, that's a big question. To be honest, when I was doing research on this, there was an incredible amount of information that came out a few months after the Panama Papers in 2016, and then it really, really tapered off, and there has not been a lot of updates since then, which was pretty interesting to me, and I don't know if that's because it was overshadowed by other events. You are correct that there has been some kind of strange incidents involving some of these reporters, and I couldn't find any resolutions to those strange incidents. Hopefully we'll get some, but I think one of the things that frustrated me when I was just trying to do research on this was the fact that it really seemed to have, in a way, blown over, at least with the general public. There are two people that are, I'm sorry, there's one person that a trial is ongoing in the United States 2 people have pled guilty, and then 1 person that was indicted by the United States, who's a Panamanian citizen, is still at large. So not a lot of US citizens, only 1 out of those 4 people were actually like a US citizen. And they were one of the people that pled guilty, so for personal tax evasion.
Yeah, I can't speak to the Panama Papers and international relations per se, but with the Bradley Birkenfield case in UBS, when Secretary of State Hillary Clinton went over to Switzerland and spoke with her Swiss counterpart, there are a number of reverberating effects and the intersections of basically quid pro quos when she went over to try and recoup some of those names and bring them back to the US soil. For example, the Swiss were actually our representatives in Iran at the time. So we didn't have an embassy there, and they ended up speaking on our behalves. We had 2 detainees in Guantanamo actually be released in Swiss territory, and the Iranians sent over a US detainee. So there are these odd reverberations that you see that come out of it. And the only reason we know about this is because of another whistleblower, Bradley Manning. The dump of all of Secretary Clinton's emails revealed a lot of these shady kind of underground deals. How much we can verify and the extent of them, we don't always know. Some of it was lost in the personal servers, as per Bradley's book. But yeah, to see the different ways in which the actions of a bunch of Swiss bank accounts can manifest on the level of international relations is extremely interesting. And it creates this system of quid pro quos.
Yeah, and I think one other thing to add, we've talked a little bit about kind of the effect of globalization on all of this. And that kind of comes into this question a little bit because, a lot of these countries that are tax havens are countries that, are not great powers. Maybe they're developing countries, whereas the countries that are doing the investigating are, United States, the UK. David Cameron, after this happened, was pushing for example, like the British Virgin Islands to crack down on the use of them for a tax haven. But then he was criticized because his father was implicated in the Panama Papers. So Panama itself, again, the United States was frustrated at Panama for letting this happen. One of the co-founders, Fonseca, was actually an advisor to the Panamanian president for a long time. So it seemed like they, kind of knew what was going on and were letting it happen. But again, the Panamanians accused the U.S. of, hypocrisy because, the U.S., as we've explained, it's fairly easy to evade taxes here. And so there was kind of a lot of blame going around, and a lot of these smaller countries, were blaming larger countries of hypocrisy in their investigations. So I think it kind of asks a broader question about, the role of globalization in these investigations. So
I think we have time for one more question.
Given that what Joe said earlier about the bigger question of should we even tax corporations and perhaps focus more on individual taxation, of course that's been a long-running debate in American history. Began in the 30s in earnest, and Joe Peckman and the Kennedy and Johnson administrations suggested doing just that to a great extent, and then also assuming that other mitigating factors that we haven't even addressed tonight, such as mobility of companies versus individuals and tax incidence, who actually pays the tax when it's imposed on a corporation or a business. With all that in mind, have we thought hard enough in this country about how to build a corporate tax code that focuses perhaps less on rate and more on how to avoid tax evasion of individuals?
I mean, have we ever? I mean, I don't know. I feel like it's almost, the answer to that, it's almost a rhetorical question. I'm tempted to give a rhetorical answer. Never, right? Like, there's never enough thought that goes into that, right? No, I mean, we're always looking for a better way to tax individuals in a better way. I mean, at the end of the day, we're trying to tax people, I think, is the answer. I mean, corporations enjoy certain benefits as corporations, and we want to tax them for that. But at the end of the day, we're taxing corporations as a way to get the individuals, for the most part. If we had a way, I mean, this is not, I'm going to speak for my preference. If we had a way to tax all income at the individual level, and there was no way for people to use corporations as a shield to hide their income and pile it up there, then I would be all for it. And that seems to me like a great idea. It strikes me that there are all sorts of practical hurdles to making that a reality. But there's plenty of room for improvement in the way that we're taxing individuals. And you know, there's so many different ways we tax different kinds of income in so many different ways and at different rates. We have a long way to go. And when we layer in the corporate tax and the confusing way in which that tax is borne by different groups, and you know, it's borne in some fashion by shareholders and the owners of capital, and by labor and by consumers, and we don't know. You know, we have ideas, and it's funny because those ideas haven't really changed a lot in, say, the last 80 years. We've been guessing that capital probably bears about 80% of it, but we don't really know. It's just an added level of confusion. So I don't know. I guess I've just gotten to be a little bit of a fatalist about it and assume we can't really extricate ourselves from the corporate tax entirely. So we just do the best we can with it, make it reduce the burdens of it, the distortions of it as much as we can, and then focus most of our attention on making the individual tax work as efficiently as it can. So that would be my preference.
Well, thank you so much for coming, everyone. Warm thank you to Professor Mason and Dr. Thorndike. I also wanted to thank the Miller Center so much for having us once again. They're always the most gracious hosts, so thank you. Also, my wonderful colleague Anna, Emmy Lockwood, our executive producer, Andy Caraluccio, our technical director, who is responsible for all this movie magic you see. He is the best in the game. He's behind the scenes, but we love him to bits. Christian Young, Laura Fang, Emma Ross, of course, our new host, and the whole Global Inquirer team in IRO. So thank you all so much for coming out. I hope you enjoyed, and as always, be sure to check out the Global Inquirer wherever you get your podcast. Thank you guys so much. That was awesome.